What if the body on display in a public exhibition was never meant to be there? What if a mother recognized her son not through a nameplate or a record, but through posture, proportion, and features she had known for a lifetime? In 2012, Christopher Tod Eric died at the age of 23. The circumstances surrounding his death were never fully explained to all members of his family. According to official accounts, his body was cremated. There was no public viewing, no independent verification. And for years, the case remained closed, not because questions were answered, but because there was no clear path to ask them. Christopher was described by those who knew him as physically healthy, disciplined, and deeply religious. He had no documented history of substance abuse or self-harm. In the months before his death, communication between his parents had deteriorated. His mother, Kim, reported being cut off from regular contact with her son. Decisions about his schooling and care were made without her involvement. When she was informed of his death, the information came late and with limited detail. Requests for documentation were met with silence or inconsistency. For most families, grief eventually settles into acceptance. For Kim, it did not. Years later, while viewing images from a traveling anatomy exhibition known as Real Bodies, she experienced a moment that would alter the course of her life. One of the preserved bodies on display appeared to her to match her son with unsettling precision. The height, the bone structure, the stance. She did not claim certainty. She claimed recognition. What followed was not an accusation of murder nor a declaration of criminal guilt. It was a request for verification. Kim asked a question that in any transparent system should have had a clear answer. Where did this body come from, and who consented to its use? That question remains unresolved. The exhibition stated that all bodies were obtained legally through donation or appropriato-informed consent. However, no identifying documentation was made available to families who raised concerns. Due to the process of plastination, DNA testing was either impossible or declined. Authorities pointed to jurisdictional limits. Each institution deferred responsibility to another. The result was a closed loop of non-answers. This case is not about proving that the body belonged to Christopher Tod Eric. No court has made such a finding. No forensic test has confirmed it. What makes this case disturbing is not a conclusion, but the absence of one. A system exists in which human remains can be displayed publicly, yet families who raise credible questions have no mechanism to verify or refute what they see. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a crime that can be named, but with a void where accountability should exist. A mother seeking clarity. An industry operating within legal gray areas, and institutions that offer reassurance without transparency. This is not a story about what can be proven. It is a story about what cannot be confirmed and why that should concern us all. Christopher Tod Eric's death, as recorded in 2012, is defined less by what is known than by what was never clarified. The official narrative presented to parts of his family was brief and final. He had died at the age of 23. His body had been cremated. There would be no viewing, no further explanation, and no remaining physical evidence to examine. For most institutions involved, the matter was considered closed. For his mother, Kim, it was anything but. According to her account, communication with Christopher had become increasingly limited in the period leading up to his death. Decisions regarding his education and living arrangements were made primarily by his father, Stephen, after the parents separated. Christopher was sent to a boarding school program that Kim states she did not approve of and did not fully understand. Contact between mother and son became sporadic. When Kim attempted to intervene or request information, she describes being excluded from discussions that directly concerned her child. The notice of Christopher's death did not come immediately. When it did arrive, it was accompanied by few details. Kim was informed that her son had died suddenly and that his body had already been cremated. There was no opportunity for independent identification. No viewing? No chance to ask questions while physical evidence still existed. The finality of cremation removed any possibility of later verification. In cases of sudden death involving young adults, families often receive comprehensive documentation. Autopsy reports. Medical findings. Clear timelines. In this case, accounts of the cause of death varied over time. Initial explanations differed from later descriptions. Kim has stated publicly that she encountered inconsistencies in how Christopher's death was characterized, including shifts in whether it was described as medical, accidental, or self-inflicted. None of these explanations were accompanied by documentation she could independently review. It is important to state clearly what is not established. There has been no legal determination that Christopher's death involved foul play. There has been no court finding of wrongdoing by any family member. These facts matter, but they do not erase the presence of unanswered questions, especially when those questions concern process rather than accusation. One of the most significant gaps involves consent. Under United States law, the use of a human body after death requires documented authorization, either from the individual prior to death or from a legally recognized next of kin. Kim has stated that she never signed any document consenting to donation, research use, or public display. She also maintains that Christopher, by character and belief, would not have consented to such use himself. Whether this assessment is correct is not the issue. The issue is that no documentation has been produced to resolve the question definitively. The absence of a body meant the absence of forensic certainty. Cremation, once completed, eliminates the possibility of DNA testing, toxicology review, or secondary examination. Any later concern becomes theoretical. In this case, the lack of transparency did not merely complicate grief. It structurally prevented verification. Years passed. Life continued in the outward sense. But unresolved loss does not recede quietly. It sharpens. When Kim later encountered images from a traveling anatomy exhibition, the recognition she describes was immediate and deeply unsettling. She did not claim proof. She claimed familiarity. A mother's recognition formed not from a single feature, but from an accumulation of physical details that, taken together, felt unmistakable to her. At that moment, the earlier information gaps took on new weight. If Christopher's body had been cremated, then recognition should have been impossible. If consent documentation existed, it should have been producible. If the system was functioning transparently, there would have been a clear mechanism to confirm or dismiss her concern. Instead, Kim encountered institutional deflection. Exhibition representatives stated that all bodies were obtained legally, but declined to provide identifying documentation. Authorities cited jurisdictional limits. The technical realities of plastination were raised as barriers to DNA testing. Each response pointed away from resolution. This is where the case shifts from personal tragedy to systemic concern. The problem is not whether Kim is correct in her belief. The problem is that there is no pathway to establish whether she is wrong. In a functioning system, unanswered questions narrow over time. Here they widened. The more Kim asked, the clearer it became that no single institution claimed responsibility for providing certainty. The chain of custody, consent, and verification dissolved into abstraction. Christopher's death, viewed through this lens, becomes the starting point of a larger issue. A young man dies. His body is declared unavailable. Years later, a preserved body appears in public view. Between those 2 points lies a void where documentation, oversight, and accountability should reside. This section does not assert conclusions. It documents absence. And in cases involving human remains, absence is not neutral. It carries ethical weight. Because when answers cannot be accessed, grief is prolonged, trust erodes, and systems designed to protect dignity lose credibility. The question that remains is not who is at fault, but who is responsible for ensuring that such questions never go unanswered in the first place. To understand why Kim's questions met a dead end, it is necessary to examine the industry she found herself confronting. Traveling exhibitions of preserved human bodies have existed for decades, marketed as educational experiences that reveal anatomy, health, and disease. They operate in museums, convention centers, and science halls across the world. To the public, they appear regulated, authoritative, and legitimate. Behind the glass, however, lies a system built on limited disclosure. Real Bodies is one of several exhibitions that display plastinated human remains. Plastination is a preservation process developed in the late 20th century in which water and lipids in biological tissue are replaced with polymer. The result is a dry, odorless specimen that can be posed and displayed indefinitely. From an educational standpoint, the technique is effective. From a forensic standpoint, it is final. Once plastination is complete, conventional DNA testing becomes nearly impossible. Organic material is altered at a molecular level. What remains is structure without traceability. In practical terms, this means that identification, once lost, cannot be recovered. Any question raised after plastination has occurred cannot be answered through scientific verification. Exhibitions address this limitation by emphasizing consent. They assert that all bodies were donated legally, with appropriate authorization. In theory, consent resolves the ethical dilemma. In practice, consent documentation is rarely made public. Visitors are asked to trust that it exists. This is where transparency becomes the central issue. Unlike organ donation systems tied to hospitals and registries, body exhibition supply chains often span multiple countries, intermediaries, and legal jurisdictions. Bodies may be sourced through donation programs, medical institutions, or third-party vendors. Each step introduces distance between the original donor and the final display. In the case of real bodies, representatives have stated that they comply with all applicable laws and that their specimens are obtained ethically. These statements are not accompanied by publicly accessible records identifying donors or outlining consent pathways. Exhibitions cite privacy protections and contractual limitations as reasons for non-disclosure. From a business perspective, this position is defensible. From a family perspective, it leaves no avenue for verification. For Kim, this lack of access was not abstract. She was not asking for the identity of all donors. She was asking whether a specific body could be definitively excluded as belonging to her son. The answer she received was not yes or no, but effectively, we cannot confirm either way. Authorities offered similar responses. Because the exhibition operated legally within its host jurisdictions, regulators pointed to compliance rather than investigation. Because no formal claim of theft or trafficking had been substantiated, law enforcement agencies declined to intervene. Because plastination prevented forensic testing, medical examiners could not assist. Each institution acknowledged the concern, then redirected responsibility elsewhere. This fragmentation is not unique to this case. The regulatory landscape governing human body exhibitions is uneven. In the United States, oversight varies by state. Some jurisdictions require documentation of consent. Others rely on exhibition assurances. There is no centralized registry. There is no standardized audit process accessible to the public. The result is a system that functions smoothly for operators but opaquely for families. The ethical tension becomes clear when viewed through this lens. Exhibitions rely on public trust to operate. Families rely on institutions to safeguard dignity after death. When trust is challenged, transparency becomes essential. Yet transparency is precisely what the system does not provide. It is important to emphasize that uncertainty does not equate to wrongdoing. The absence of evidence is not evidence of abuse. But in matters involving human remains, ethical responsibility extends beyond legal minimums. When questions arise, the inability to answer them undermines confidence not only in a single exhibition, but in the industry as a whole. Kim's requests highlighted a structural vulnerability. If a body were misidentified, improperly sourced, or used without valid consent, there would be no reliable mechanism to detect or correct the error after plastination. The process itself renders accountability retrospective and theoretical. Once a specimen is displayed, its origin is effectively sealed. This reality places families in an impossible position. Recognition without proof becomes a psychological burden rather than a legal claim. Mothers, fathers, and siblings are left to reconcile what they see with what they are told, without a neutral authority empowered to resolve the conflict. The industry's response to such concerns has typically been uniform. Operators reaffirm legality. Regulators cite jurisdiction. Technical experts explain limitations. None of these responses address the core issue. They explain why verification is difficult, not why it should be acceptable. In this case, Kim did not demand that the exhibition be shut down. She did not seek damages. She sought clarity. The system offered none. This is the transparency problem at the heart of the story. Not an allegation of intent, but a demonstration of design. An industry built in a way that makes certain questions unanswerable by default. When consent documentation is private, oversight decentralized, and forensic verification impossible, accountability becomes conditional. For most visitors, this structure remains invisible. The experience is educational, controlled, and brief. For families who raise concerns, it becomes a wall. As the case continued to circulate publicly, it drew attention not because of what could be proven, but because of what could not. The inability to conclusively confirm or deny a mother's fear exposed a gap between legality and legitimacy. Something can comply with the law and still fail to meet ethical expectation. This is where the case of Christopher Tod Eric intersects with a broader societal question. How should systems that handle human remains balance privacy, commerce, education, and accountability? And when a family asks a question that cuts across all four, who is responsible for answering it? The system as it currently exists offers no clear response. When Kim sought answers, she did not encounter a single authority empowered to resolve her concerns. Instead, she entered a legal gray zone where responsibility was distributed so thinly that it effectively disappeared. This was not the result of a hidden conspiracy, but of a system structured around minimum compliance rather than comprehensive accountability. In the United States, the handling of human remains is governed primarily at the state level. Regulations vary widely. Some states require documentation of consent for the use of bodies in research or display. Others rely on representations made by operators without independent verification. There is no unified national registry for body donation tied to public exhibitions. There is no standardized audit process accessible to families. Oversight exists, but it is fragmented. This fragmentation matters because it shapes how concerns are addressed. When Kim contacted exhibition organizers, she was referred to their legal assurances. When she contacted local authorities, she was told the exhibition was operating within the law. When she sought forensic confirmation, she was informed that plastination made such testing impractical. Each response was accurate within its narrow scope. Together, they formed an impasse. The concept of consent lies at the center of this impasse. Legally, consent is treated as a binary condition. Either it exists or it does not. Ethically, consent is more complex. It requires clarity, traceability, and the ability to be verified when questioned. In this case, consent was asserted but not demonstrable to those most directly affected. From an institutional perspective, there are reasons for this opacity. Donor anonymity is often cited as a protection. Contracts with third-party suppliers are treated as proprietary. Cross-border sourcing complicates disclosure. Yet these justifications prioritize operational convenience over public confidence. They also leave families without recourse. Kim's case illustrates a critical limitation of current frameworks. Even if all legal requirements were met, there is no mechanism to resolve disputes rooted in recognition rather than documentation. A mother's concern, however sincere, does not trigger investigation unless accompanied by evidence. Evidence, however, cannot be obtained because the system has removed the means of obtaining it. This circular logic places families in an untenable position. They are asked to trust systems that offer no way to verify trustworthiness. When they question that trust, they are told no violation can be proven. Accountability becomes theoretical. The legal system is not designed to address this type of harm. Courts adjudicate disputes based on evidence and standing. In this case, there is no identifiable defendant accused of a specific unlawful act. There is no physical evidence available for examination. There is no clear jurisdiction in which to file a claim that would compel disclosure without alleging wrongdoing. The absence of a crime does not resolve the presence of concern. Regulatory agencies face similar constraints. Without statutory mandates requiring disclosure of donor records to third parties, regulators have limited authority. They can verify compliance with existing rules, but they cannot compel transparency beyond those rules. As a result, compliance becomes the ceiling rather than the floor. This is the distinction that defines the case. The question is not whether the exhibition violated the law. It is whether the law is sufficient to address situations like this at all. When systems handle human remains, the stakes are uniquely high. Errors cannot be reversed. Doubt cannot be easily dispelled. The consequences of uncertainty extend beyond individual cases, shaping public trust in institutions meant to safeguard dignity after death. The response to Kim's concerns exposed a broader vulnerability. Industries that operate across jurisdictions, rely on irreversible processes, and are shielded by privacy protections can become functionally unaccountable even when acting within legal bounds. This is not an indictment of intent. It is an observation about design. Public reaction to the case reflected this unease. Supporters did not claim proof. They demanded transparency. Critics argued that emotional recognition is insufficient grounds for institutional scrutiny. Both positions highlight the same flaw. The system offers no neutral mechanism to bridge the gap between personal conviction and legal certainty. As the story circulated, it attracted attention precisely because it resisted resolution. There was no definitive revelation, no court ruling, no forensic breakthrough. What remained was a persistent question left unanswered by design. In most legal disputes, time clarifies. Here, time only entrenched uncertainty. This outcome raises a final consideration. Accountability is not solely a matter of punishment. It is also a matter of reassurance. When institutions handle matters as sensitive as human remains, their responsibility extends to providing credible answers when doubts arise. A system that cannot do so invites erosion of trust, even in the absence of wrongdoing. Kim's case did not collapse because evidence disproved her belief. It stalled because no pathway existed to address it. That distinction matters. It shifts the focus from individual actors to structural limits, from accusations to architecture. In this legal gray zone, the burden of uncertainty rests entirely on families. The system remains intact, compliant, and unmoved. Whether that balance is acceptable is a question the law has yet to answer. There are cases that end with verdicts, and there are cases that end with silence. The story of Christopher Tod Eric belongs to the latter. Not because facts were disproven, but because the system offers no mechanism to determine them conclusively. More than a decade after Christopher's death, no authority has confirmed that his body was misused. No institution has established that it was not. That absence of resolution is the defining outcome. It reveals a system capable of operating legally while remaining fundamentally unverifiable to those most affected by its decisions. Kim's search for clarity was not driven by accusation, but by absence. She did not claim criminal certainty. She asked for confirmation. She asked for documentation. She asked for a way to reconcile what she was told with what she believed she saw. Each request met the same barrier. There was no path forward that did not require alleging wrongdoing, and no evidence available that could satisfy such an allegation. This case illustrates the distinction that often goes unexamined. Legality does not guarantee legitimacy. Compliance does not ensure trust. When systems manage human remains, the ethical threshold cannot stop at minimum legal standards. It must account for transparency, traceability, and the ability to resolve doubt when it arises. The body exhibition industry operates in a space shaped by irreversible processes and fragmented oversight. Plastination eliminates forensic recourse. Privacy protections limit disclosure. Jurisdictional boundaries diffuse responsibility. Individually, these elements are defensible. Collectively, they create an environment in which accountability becomes optional rather than essential. Christopher's story is not unique because of what can be proven. It is unique because of what cannot. A young man dies. His body is declared unavailable. Years later, a preserved body appears in public view. Between those 2 points, there is no authoritative record capable of closing the gap. That void is where uncertainty takes root. For families, unresolved loss does not fade. It persists. It reshapes grief into vigilance. Kim's experience demonstrates how easily trust erodes when systems cannot answer basic questions. Her concern may never be validated or disproven. That reality does not diminish its significance. It underscores a structural flaw that extends beyond any single exhibition or case. This file does not close with an accusation. It closes with a warning. When institutions are designed without pathways for verification, they shift the burden of uncertainty onto individuals who have the least power to resolve it. When answers are structurally unreachable, doubt becomes permanent. The question this case leaves behind is not who is responsible for Christopher Tod Eric's death, or whether a particular body belongs to him. The question is whether systems that handle human remains should be allowed to function without a clear obligation to provide certainty when doubts arise. Until that question is addressed, stories like this will continue to surface. Not because wrongdoing is proven, but because transparency is absent. This concludes the file. Not with resolution, but with a reminder that when answers cannot be reached, the system itself becomes part of the story.